He followed her into the he followed her into the slums, expecting to catch a thief. But when he saw what she was hiding behind those broken doors, he realized he was the one with the empty heart. Silence was the most expensive commodity Julian Thorne owned. In a city like New York, where the noise of ambition never slept, silence was a luxury reserved for the men at the very top of the food chain. And Julian was undeniably at the top. From the 45th floor of his penthouse overlooking Central Park, the chaos of Manhattan was nothing more than a silent, glittering circuit board. Julian stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass wall, swirling a glass of 30-year-old single malt scotch. At 38, he had the kind of face that graced the covers of Forbes and GQ. Sharp jawline, eyes the color of cold steel, and an expression that suggested he knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. He was a man who built his empire on data, on predicting human behavior, and on the cynical belief that everyone, eventually, would try to take something from him. He was rarely wrong. Behind him, the soft click of ceramic against marble broke the stillness. "Will that be all for tonight, Mr. Thorne?" Julian didn't turn around. He knew the voice. Soft, deferential, blending into the background. It belonged to Elena, his housekeeper. "Leave the lights on in the study, Elena. You can go." "Yes, sir, good night." He watched her reflection in the glass window as she retreated. Elena was efficient. That was the only word for her. She had been working for him for 6 months. She was young, perhaps late 20s, with a face that was pleasant but guarded, always scrubbed clean of makeup, her dark hair pulled back in a severe, practical bun. She moved through his sprawling penthouse like a phantom, scrubbing, polishing, and organizing until the place looked like a museum exhibit rather than a home. She was perfect, and that was exactly why Julian didn't trust her. In Julian's world, perfection was usually a mask. The suspicion started with the food. It was a trivial thing, something a man of his net worth shouldn't even notice, let alone care about. 2 weeks ago, Julian had hosted a small private dinner for some potential investors from Tokyo. The catering had been exquisite: Wagyu beef sliders, truffle-infused risotto, lobster tails. There had been leftovers, a significant amount. Usually, the protocol was simple. The staff could have a meal, and the rest was disposed of. Julian hated clutter in his fridge. But the next morning, when he opened the refrigerator to grab a bottle of water, he noticed the shelves were pristine, empty. Not just the food, but the high-end Tupperware containers he kept for storage were gone. He frowned. Had she thrown them out? Or had she taken them? Then came the schedule changes. "Mr. Thorne?" He looked up from his tablet one Tuesday afternoon. Elena was standing in the doorway of his study, wringing her hands slightly. It was the first time he had seen her nervous. "Yes? I was wondering if it would be all right if I left at 5:30 today. I have an appointment." "An appointment," Julian repeated, his voice flat. "Yes, sir. It's personal." He studied her. Her eyes were rimmed with red, as if she hadn't slept. Her uniform, usually impeccable, looked slightly wrinkled at the hem. "Fine," he said, turning back to his screen. "Ensure the laundry is finished before you go." "Thank you, sir." She left at 5:30 sharp. Then again on Thursday. Then on Friday. Julian stood on his balcony that Friday evening, the wind whipping at his suit jacket, watching the street below. He saw a small figure exit the service entrance of his building. It was Elena. She wasn't walking toward the subway station that led to Queens, where her file said she lived. She was carrying 2 heavy, bulging tote bags. She looked around nervously, like a fugitive checking for a tail, before hailing a yellow cab, an expense a maid on her salary shouldn't be making daily. She disappeared into the traffic. Julian took a sip of his scotch, the ice clinking against the glass. Observation 2. Irregular movements and unexplained cargo. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday in November. The market had been brutal. Julian had spent 12 hours negotiating a merger that was falling apart, and his patience was thinner than a razor blade. He arrived home early, around 4 p.m., expecting the house to be empty and silent. Instead, he heard a voice coming from the utility room off the kitchen. He stopped, his loafers making no sound on the hardwood floor. He moved closer, the predator in him awakening. It was Elena. She was speaking in hushed, urgent tones. I know it's not enough yet. Please, just give me 2 more days. A pause. Julian leaned against the wall, listening. I'm trying. He's demanding. The schedule is hard. But I'll get the rest. I promise. Don't hurt. She cut herself off, her voice cracking. I'll bring the cash tonight. Yes, all of it. The call ended. Julian stepped back into the shadows of the hallway as Elena emerged a moment later, her face pale, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She didn't see him. She went straight to the pantry, grabbed a box of garbage bags, and returned to her work. Julian retreated to his study, his heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm of anger. Debts, gambling, drugs, an abusive boyfriend. It didn't matter what the vice was. What mattered was that she was desperate, and desperate people were dangerous. Desperate people with access to a penthouse filled with Patek Philippe watches, limited edition art, and sensitive corporate documents were a liability he could not afford. She's stealing from me, Julian whispered to the empty room. It was the only logical explanation. How else does a maid promise cash tonight to a threatening voice on the phone? He needed proof. He wasn't a man who fired people based on hunches. He destroyed them with evidence. The opportunity arrived an hour later. A violent thunderstorm had rolled over the city, turning the sky a bruised purple. Elena had gone out to run an errand, supposedly to pick up dry cleaning, and had just returned. Julian was in the kitchen, pouring himself a coffee, when the service elevator opened. Elena stumbled in, soaked to the bone. She hadn't brought an umbrella. She was shivering, holding her coat tight against her chest as if protecting something. You're dripping on the floor, Julian said, his voice cutting through the sound of the rain against the windows. Elena jumped, her eyes wide. Oh, I'm so sorry, Mr. Thorne. I didn't know you were in here. I'll clean it up immediately. She hurriedly took off her heavy wool coat. It was an old, fraying thing, completely waterlogged. She moved to hang it on the rack by the door, but her hands were shaking so badly she dropped it. Leave it, Julian commanded. He stepped forward. Go get a towel for yourself before you catch pneumonia. I don't need sick staff. Thank you, sir, she whispered, looking grateful for what she perceived as kindness. She rushed toward the bathroom. As soon as she was out of sight, Julian's expression hardened. He looked down at the wet coat. It was heavy. Too heavy. He knelt down. He wasn't proud of this, rummaging through a woman's pockets, but he was protecting his fortress. He reached into the deep right pocket. His fingers brushed against wet receipts, a set of keys, and then a thick, folded piece of paper that felt different. He pulled it out. It was a bank transaction slip. It was slightly damp, but the ink was still legible. Julian squinted at the numbers, and his breath hitched in his throat. Transfer amount, $5,500. Recipient, Green Light Holdings, LLC. Method, cash deposit, $5,500. In cash. Julian did the mental math instantly. That was nearly 2 months of her salary. How did a woman who wore shoes with worn-out soles and lived in a shared apartment in Queens simply deposit $5,000 in cash on a random Tuesday? He checked the date. It was today. He stood up, the paper crinkling in his fist. Where did she get it? He glanced toward his study. The safe was locked. He checked his watch. He hadn't worn the vintage Rolex Daytona in a week. Was it still in the drawer? What about the cash he kept in the decorative vase in the foyer? A cold fury washed over him. He had let a thief into his sanctuary. She played the part of the struggling, humble mouse perfectly, all while siphoning off his wealth right under his nose. Footsteps approached. Julian quickly shoved the receipt back into the pocket of the wet coat and stepped away, leaning casually against the kitchen island just as Elena returned. She had dried her face and was reaching for a mop. "I'll have this dry in a second, sir," she said, avoiding his eyes. Julian watched her. He looked at her hands, red from the cold and from scrubbing his floors. He looked at her posture, bowed, submissive. It was a brilliant performance. "Elena," he said. His voice was dangerously calm. She froze. "Yes, sir. You're leaving early again tonight, aren't you?" She hesitated, gripping the mop handle tighter. If that is acceptable, I have finished all the tasks on the list." "Of course," Julian smiled. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Go. Take your bags. Take whatever you need." "Thank you, Mr. Thorne." She didn't hear the sarcasm. She didn't hear the trap snapping shut. 10 minutes later, Elena Rossi walked out of the service entrance of the building, carrying those same two mysterious, heavy tote bags, heading into the rainy night. He was going to follow her. He was going to see exactly where his money was going. He was going to find the boyfriend, the drug dealer, or the fence she was selling his stolen goods to. And when he had the full picture, he would ensure she never worked in this city again. Julian stepped into the elevator, his reflection in the mirrored walls looking back at him, a man who had everything, about to hunt down a woman who had nothing. Game. The rain in New York. The rain in New York doesn't wash the city clean. It just makes the grime slicker. Julian Thorne sat behind the wheel of his black Audi RS7, the engine purring with a low, predatory hum. He was parked half a block down from the service entrance, his windshield wipers slicing through the deluge. He watched as Elena struggled with her umbrella, the two heavy tote bags weighing down her slender frame. She looked like a gust of wind could blow her away. She didn't hail a cab this time. She walked to the subway station at 77th Street. Julian waited until she disappeared underground before pulling out into traffic. He didn't need to follow her onto the train. He knew the city's veins. He tracked the subway line on his GPS, driving parallel to the tracks, his mind racing with dark scenarios. "Where are you going, Elena?" He expected her to get off in Queens, perhaps Astoria or Woodside, where the working class returned to their cramped apartments. But the train kept moving. It pushed further east, past the gentrified neighborhoods, past the safe zones, deep into the East New York terminus, a place where the streetlights were often broken and the police sirens were a constant background score. He parked his car on a cracked pavement under the shadow of an elevated train track. The area was desolate. Warehouses with boarded-up windows stood like rotting teeth against the skyline. It was the kind of place people like Julian only saw on the news, usually accompanied by yellow police tape. Elena emerged from the station exit 2 blocks away. Julian killed his headlights. He watched her walk. The change in her demeanor was immediate. In his penthouse, she walked with a soft, apologetic tread, trying to take up as little space as possible. Here, on these dangerous streets, she walked with purpose. She moved fast, head up, navigating the puddles and the piles of trash, with a familiarity that unsettled him. She turned down a narrow alleyway between 2 industrial buildings. Julian stepped out of his car. The rain instantly soaked his Italian wool coat, ruining a $5,000 garment in seconds. He didn't care. He checked the Glock 19 he kept in his glove box, hesitated, then tucked it into his waistband. If she was meeting a dealer or a loan shark, things could get volatile. He followed her, sticking to the shadows. The alley opened up into a small, debris-littered courtyard. At the far end stood a dilapidated brick building. It looked like it had been a factory once, 50 years ago. Now the windows were barred, and the red brick was stained with soot. Above the rusted metal door hung a wooden sign, swinging precariously in the wind. The paint was peeling, but the words were legible under the flicker of a dying street lamp. Green Hope Community Center. Green Hope. Julian frowned. The name sounded innocent, almost pathetic in this setting. Was it a front? A money laundering operation? A cult? Elena unlocked the heavy metal door and slipped inside. A moment later, a warm, yellow light spilled out from the high, grime-covered windows. Julian approached the building. The mud sucked at his expensive loafers. He found a window at ground level where the glass was intact, but the curtain was slightly askew. He wiped the rain from the pane with his sleeve and peered inside. The breath left his lungs in a sharp, cold hiss. He had expected to see a room full of smoke, stacks of cash, perhaps men with tattoos counting drug money. He had prepared himself to see Elena handing over his stolen cash to a brute. Instead, he saw a classroom. It was a large, drafty hall with peeling paint and water stains on the ceiling. But the floor was swept clean. Rows of mismatched plastic chairs were arranged in a semicircle, facing a chalkboard that had seen better days. And the room was full. There were about 30 people. They were the invisible people of the city, old men with weathered skin, women in hijabs holding sleeping toddlers, young men with callous hands still covered in construction dust. They looked tired. They looked hungry. They looked cold. But their eyes were all fixed on one person, Elena. She had shed her soaking wet coat. She wasn't wearing her maid's uniform anymore. Underneath, she wore a simple white blouse and jeans. She stood at the front of the room, not with the hunched shoulders of a servant, but with the posture of a queen. She was smiling. It wasn't the polite, tight-lipped smile she gave him when he asked for coffee. It was a radiant, genuine expression that lit up her entire face. She was clapping her hands, gesturing to the chalkboard where she had written in neat, bold letters, "I am worthy, I am capable, I am here." Julian watched, mesmerized, as the thief he had come to destroy picked up a piece of chalk. She wasn't dealing drugs. She was teaching English. "Repeat after me," he imagined her saying, watching her lips move. An elderly man in the front row, whose hands shook with age, or perhaps Parkinson's, stood up. He struggled to speak. Elena didn't rush him. She walked over, knelt beside his chair, kneeling on the dirty floor without a second thought, and placed a hand on his shoulder. She whispered something to him. The man took a breath, spoke, and then smiled, a toothless, proud grin. Elena beamed back at him, squeezing his hand. Julian felt a strange, uncomfortable twisting in his gut. He shifted his weight, his eyes moving to the corner of the room where a long folding table was set up. There were the tote bags. Elena moved to the table now. The lesson was over. It was time for something else. She began unpacking them. Julian squinted. He recognized the containers. The stolen Tupperware. She popped the lids. Steam rose up. It was the leftovers from his dinner party 2 nights ago. The Wagyu sliders, the truffle risotto, the expensive artisan bread. She was scooping the food onto paper plates, rationing it out carefully so that everyone got a share. She hadn't eaten it herself. She hadn't sold it. She had smuggled it out across the city, risking her job, just to feed these people who looked like they hadn't had a hot meal in days. And the cash? The $5,500 receipt? Julian's eyes scanned the room and landed on a man in a jumpsuit standing by the back wall, holding a clipboard and looking impatient. Elena walked over to him. She pulled an envelope from her jeans pocket, thick, white. She handed it to the man. He counted it, nodded, scribbled something on a receipt, and handed it to her. Then he pointed at the ceiling, seemingly complaining about a leak. before walking out. It was the landlord, or the utility company. She was paying the rent for this ruin. Julian pulled back from the window, his back hitting the rough brick wall. The rain hammered against his face, mixing with the sudden hot flush of shame that burned his skin. He slid down until he was crouching in the mud. For years, Julian had prided himself on his ability to read people. He saw everyone as assets or liabilities, predators or prey. He had looked at Elena and seen a simple, perhaps dishonest servant. He had looked at her silence and seen submission. He was wrong. God, he was so wrong. Inside that building, amidst the mold and the decay, Elena was a giant. She possessed a kind of power he couldn't buy with his billions. He owned skyscrapers, but she owned these people's hearts. He commanded respect through fear and salary. She commanded it through sheer, unadulterated love. He thought of his penthouse, the marble floors, the climate-controlled wine cellar, the absolute suffocating silence of his life. He had everything money could buy, yet he spent his nights drinking alone, suspecting the only person who made his house feel human. She had nothing. She wore a second-hand coat and scrubbed his toilets. Yet here she was, pouring herself out for strangers, feeding them with the crumbs from his table. Keeping a roof over their heads with money, she likely worked 3 jobs to scrape together. The rich man was crouching in the mud outside. The poor woman was shining like a lighthouse inside. Julian stood up slowly. His legs felt heavy. He looked through the window one last time. Elena was laughing now, holding a baby, while the mother ate the risotto he had almost thrown in the trash. She looked exhausted, yes, but she looked alive. He felt a sudden, desperate urge to walk in there, to apologize, to hand her his wallet, to do something, but he couldn't. Not like this. Not as the suspicious boss who had stalked her in the night. It would shatter the sanctity of what she was doing. It would humiliate her. He turned away from the window. He walked back to his car in the pouring rain. The image of her kneeling beside the old man burned into his retinas. He unlocked his Audi, the interior smelling of expensive leather, and now wet defeat. He started the engine but didn't drive away immediately. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. "Green hope," he whispered. He put the car in gear. He wasn't going to fire her. He wasn't going to call the police. Julian Thorne was going to war. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't fighting for profit. He was going to fight for her, and she was never going to know it was him. As he drove back toward the lights of Manhattan, the city looked different. The skyscrapers didn't look like monuments of success anymore. They looked like cages. And for the first time, Julian wanted to break out. The morning after the rainstorm, the penthouse felt different. The marble floors were just as cold, the view of Central Park just as breathtaking, but the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of a secret kept. Julian Thorne sat at the head of his mahogany dining table, an untouched espresso in front of him. He wasn't reading the Wall Street Journal. He was watching the door. When Elena entered with a fresh pitcher of water, Julian didn't look at her uniform or the way she kept her eyes lowered. He looked at her hands. He saw the red knuckles, raw from the cold wind of East New York. He saw the faint tremor of exhaustion in her fingers, fingers that had spooned risotto onto paper plates for the homeless only hours ago. "Good morning, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice steady, betraying nothing of her double life. "Morning, Elena," Julian replied. He tested the weight of her name on his tongue. It felt different now. It commanded respect. "Is the coffee to your liking, sir?" "It's fine," he said, pausing. Then, for the first time in 6 months, he deviated from the script. "You look tired, Elena. Did you sleep well?" She froze for a fraction of a second, the pitcher hovering over his glass. Yes, sir. Thank you for asking. Just a long night." I imagine so, he murmured, taking a sip. The storm was brutal. She didn't catch the double meaning. She finished pouring and retreated to the kitchen. Julian watched her go, a strange ache settling in his chest. He had spent his life surrounded by people who wanted his money, his influence, or his body. Here was a woman who was literally stealing his leftovers to save the world, and she hadn't asked him for a dime. It was time to intervene. But Julian Thorne didn't do charity. He did strategy. By noon, Julian had the dossier. He hadn't gone to the office. Instead, he had summoned his private investigator, a man named Voss, who could find a needle in a haystack and tell you who manufactured the steel. Green Hope Community Center, Voss said, sliding a thin manila folder across Julian's desk. It's a miracle the place is still standing, boss. It's run by a non-profit registered to a deceased pastor. The current operations are held together by duct tape and prayers. Julian flipped the file open. Financials? Abysmal. They are 3 months behind on rent. The landlord, a guy named Slattery, is a slumlord. He's looking for an excuse to evict them so he can sell the lot to developers. They have a heating bill of $4,000 outstanding. And, Voss pointed to a name on the list of volunteers. Your housekeeper, Elena Rossi, is listed as the interim director. Julian stared at the photo of Elena attached to the file. It was a candid shot, likely taken during a community event. She was laughing, her hair messy, her face smudged with paint. She looked beautiful. She puts in about 70% of her income into this place, Voss noted, shaking his head. It's practically a black hole. It's not a black hole, Julian corrected sharply. It's an investment in human capital. Voss raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. Set up a shell company, Julian commanded, closing the file. Call it the Janus Group. I want you to contact this landlord, Slattery. Tell him the back rent is covered, plus 6 months in advance. But there's a condition. He cannot know where the money came from. If he leaks a name, the deal is void. Done. Anything else? Julian looked out the window. Yes, the heating bill, the roof repairs, and open a line of credit for food supplies with a wholesale distributor. Make it look like a government grant or a clerical error in their favor. I don't care how you dress it up, just make sure she doesn't know it's me. You're playing God, Julian, Voss said, gathering his things. No, Julian replied softly. I'm just leveling the playing field. 2 days later, the change in Elena was palpable. Julian was in the library pretending to read a quarterly report when she came in to dust the bookshelves. Usually, she moved with a heavy, burdened efficiency. Today, there was a bounce in her step. She was humming. It was a soft, melodic tune he didn't recognize, but it filled the austere room with warmth. You seem in good spirits, Julian remarked, not looking up from his paper. Elena stopped dusting. She turned to him, her face glowing. She looked 10 years younger. Oh, I'm sorry, sir. Was I too loud? No, just happy. She bit her lip, debating whether to share. The joy was too big to contain. It's just something wonderful happened today. A personal matter. A problem I thought was impossible to solve. It just vanished. Is that so? Julian turned a page, hiding a smirk. Miracles happen, I suppose. Yes, she breathed, clutching the feather duster to her chest. They really do. She went back to work, scrubbing a spot on the mahogany ladder that was already clean. Julian watched her. He felt a surge of satisfaction that no hostile takeover or stock spike had ever given him. He had bought that smile, and it was worth every penny of the $50,000 he had secretly funneled into East New York that morning. But as he watched her, a new thought formed. He had saved her sanctuary, yes, but saving the building wasn't enough. He needed to know her. He knew she was kind. He knew she was brave, but was she just a martyr, or was she something more? He decided to test her. The test began with a book. Julian knew Elena dusted the library every Tuesday and Thursday. On Tuesday morning, he deliberately left a book on the small reading table she usually organized. It wasn't a novel. It was The Price of Inequality by Joseph Stiglitz, a dense economic critique of modern capitalism. He placed it there, open, with a pen lying next to it, as if he had been taking notes. When he walked in later that afternoon, Elena was there. She wasn't dusting. She was standing by the table, staring down at the open page. Her brow was furrowed in intense concentration. "Interesting read," Julian said, his voice startling her. Elena jumped, her hand flying to her chest. "Mr. Thorne, I apologize. I wasn't reading. I was just moving it to clean." "It's fine, Elena," Julian said, walking over to the bourbon decanter. He poured a drink, keeping his back to her. "Actually, I was finding it a bit tedious. The author argues that efficiency and equality are trade-offs, that you can't have both." He turned around, swirling the amber liquid. "What do you think?" It was a trap. A trap to see if she would retreat into the role of the submissive maid. "I wouldn't know, sir." Or if she would step into the light. Elena looked at him. She looked at the book. Then she took a breath. Her posture straightened. "I think he's writing from a tower, sir." Julian raised an eyebrow. "Explain." "Efficiency without equality isn't efficient," she said, her voice gaining strength. "It's brittle. If you build a system where 90% of the parts are grinding against each other just to keep the top 10% spinning, eventually the machine breaks. Real efficiency requires maintenance of the whole, not just the engine." Julian stared at her. It wasn't just a smart answer. It was a profound one. It was an engineering metaphor applied to macroeconomics. "You speak as if you've studied this," he said softly. Elena lowered her eyes, the mask slipping back on. I read a lot, sir. Libraries are free." "Don't stop," Julian said, stepping closer. The distance between them felt charged, electric. "The machine breaks. That's an interesting perspective. So, if you were the mechanic, how would you fix it?" For the next 20 minutes, the billionaire and the maid stood in the library, debating economic theory. Elena spoke of microloans, of community-based education, of the cycle of poverty not as a character flaw, but as a resource desert. She was brilliant. Her ideas were raw, unpolished by Ivy League rhetoric, but they were sharp and deeply pragmatic. She wasn't just a teacher. She was a visionary. She didn't just want to feed the poor. She wanted to dismantle the system that made them poor. "I've taken up too much of your time," Elena suddenly realized, stepping back, looking horrified at her own boldness. "I have to finish the guest room." "Elena," Julian called out as she turned to leave. She paused at the door. "Yes, sir?" "The book," he said, gesturing to the heavy volume. "Take it. I've finished with it." She looked at the book, then at him. A flash of gratitude, raw and unguarded, passed through her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne." Over the next few weeks, the game continued. It became the highlight of Julian's day. He would leave out books, Plato, Orwell, contemporary policy papers. They would have accidental conversations in the kitchen, in the hallway, in the garden. He learned that she had been a top student in her high school, but had dropped out of college when her mother got sick. He learned that she spoke 3 languages, English, Spanish, and Italian, learned from the neighbors in her building. He learned that she dreamt of turning Greenhope into a trade school, not just a shelter. He was falling. It wasn't a dramatic movie star fall. It was a slow, terrifying slide. He sat in board meetings with women who were heiresses, supermodels, CEOs, women with perfect skin and sharp, jagged ambition. but all he could think about was the woman who wore a polyester uniform and smelled of lemon furniture polish and old paper. These other women wanted Julian Thorne, the billionaire. Elena challenged Julian, the man. One rainy evening, 3 weeks after the first donation, Julian came home to find Elena in the kitchen. She wasn't working. She was sitting at the small island, her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Julian froze. His first instinct was to command, to fix. Who hurt you? I'll buy their building and evict them. He walked over slowly. Elena? She looked up. Her eyes were red, but she wasn't crying from sadness. She was holding a letter. I don't understand, she whispered. What is it? The center, she choked out. Someone, an anonymous donor. They didn't just pay the rent. They sent a grant letter today. They want to fund a renovation, a full renovation. New computers, a kitchen, heating. She looked at Julian, her eyes wide with disbelief. It's $50,000, sir. Who does that? Who gives that kind of money to a place nobody cares about without even wanting their name on the wall? Julian leaned against the counter, his heart hammered in his chest. He wanted to tell her. God, he wanted to tell her. He wanted to see the look on her face when she realized her enemy, the cold, capitalist boss, was her savior. But he knew he couldn't. Not yet. If she knew it was him, she would feel indebted. The dynamic would shift to gratitude, and he didn't want her gratitude. He wanted her respect. He wanted her love, freely given, not purchased. Perhaps, Julian said, his voice rough, they see what I see. Elena frowned, confused. What you see? Julian looked her dead in the eye. He stripped away the layer of the boss, just for a second. That some things are too valuable to let fail. The air in the kitchen grew heavy. Elena stared at him, her breath hitching. For a moment, the silence wasn't expensive. It was intimate. She searched his face, looking for the meaning behind the words. Mr. Thorne, she started, her voice trembling. Go home, Elena, he said softly, pushing himself off the counter. Go tell your people the good news. You've earned it. He walked out of the kitchen before he did something reckless, like kiss her. He went to his study and poured a drink, his hands shaking slightly. He realized then that he was in trouble. He wasn't just her patron anymore. He was a man obsessed. He looked at the dossier on his desk. The next step of his plan was already in motion. The money was just the bandage, the cure. That was coming next. He picked up his phone and dialed Voss. It's me, Julian said. The renovation fund went through. Now, I want you to prepare the second phase. Phase 2? Voss asked. What's phase 2? Buying the block? No, Julian smiled, a genuine, terrifyingly hopeful smile. Phase 2 is the gala. I'm going to bring green hope out of the shadows. And I'm going to make sure the whole city sees Elena Rossi the way I do. You're going to blow her cover, Julian? No, Julian replied, looking at the rain streaking his window. I'm going to give her a crown. Julian looked at it. He didn't need to open it to know what it was. The air in the study felt thin, brittle. I'm resigning, sir, Elena said softly. She was standing on the other side of the mahogany desk, her hands clasped in front of her apron. She looked terrified, but beneath the fear, there was a new, undeniable solidity. She wasn't asking for permission. She was stating a fact. Julian felt a cold spike of panic drive itself into his chest. This was the one variable he hadn't calculated in his grand equation. He had saved her community center. He had anonymously paid off the crippling hospital bills for her mother's surgery, a debt that had been hanging over her neck like a guillotine. He had done it all to liberate her mind so she could shine. He hadn't realized that by liberating her, he was giving her the freedom to leave him. 2 weeks' notice? Julian asked, his voice flat, masking the chaos inside. Yes, sir. I, I don't want to leave you in a lurch, but with the new grunt for the center and my mother finally recovering, she paused, a small, disbelief-filled smile touching her lips. I have the opportunity to work at Green Hope full-time. The board, well, the donor, allocated a salary for a director. It's my dream, Mr. Thorne. I can finally fight for them with everything I have. I know, Julian thought. I wrote the check. I created the position. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city he owned, but suddenly felt no connection to. He was losing her. The morning coffees, the debates about economics in the library, the quiet presence that made his penthouse feel like a home. It was all about to vanish. He wanted to turn around and say, "Stay. I'll pay you triple. I'll buy the whole neighborhood. Just don't walk out that door." But that was Julian the tyrant speaking. The man Elena had changed wouldn't do that. He respected her too much to keep her in a uniform when she was born to wear armor. He turned back, his face a mask of calm control. "I accept your resignation, Elena." Her shoulders sagged with relief. "Thank you, sir. I'll make sure the new housekeeper is fully trained before I go." "That won't be necessary," Julian said, perhaps too quickly. "However, there is one final instruction before you leave my employment." Elena stiffened. "Sir?" Julian picked up a heavy, cream-colored envelope from his desk drawer. It was embossed with the silver crest of the Thorne Foundation. He slid it across the mahogany surface. "The Thorne Foundation is hosting its annual charity gala this Saturday at the Plaza. We are honoring local grassroots leaders." He looked her in the eye. "You are the guest of honor, Elena. You and Green Hope." Elena's mouth fell open slightly. "Me? But I'm just the interim." "You are the catalyst," Julian interrupted firmly. "The event is black tie. A car will collect you at 7 o'clock. Mr. Thorne, I don't belong in a room like that." "You belong there more than anyone else who will be in that room," he said, his voice dropping an octave, intensely serious. "Do not disappoint me on your last week, Elena." She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the invitation. Then, slowly, she picked it up. "I'll be there." The night of the gala, the Plaza Hotel was a fortress of light. Paparazzi flashed their bulbs against the limousines, depositing senators, tech moguls, and socialites onto the red carpet. Julian stood on the mezzanine level of the grand ballroom, gripping the railing. He wore a tuxedo that cost more than most cars, but he felt like he was wearing a straitjacket. He checked his watch for the 10th time. "Where is she?" Then the heavy oak doors opened. The room, usually a cacophony of polite laughter and clinking crystal, seemed to dim for a fraction of a second. Elena stood at the entrance. She wasn't wearing a uniform. She wasn't wearing the worn-out wool coat. She was wearing a gown of midnight blue velvet, simple in cut but devastating in its elegance. A dress that Julian had secretly arranged to be sent to her apartment that morning with a note saying, "From an admirer of your work." She looked terrified. Her eyes darted around the room, wide and deer-like. But then she took a breath, lifted her chin, and stepped forward. Julian felt his heart slam against his ribs. She was magnificent. He made his way down the grand staircase, ignoring the board members trying to catch his attention. He moved through the crowd like a shark parting a school of fish until he reached her. "Elena!" She turned, startled. When she saw him, her shoulders relaxed. "Mr. Thorne, I feel like I'm going to throw up." "You look extraordinary," he said. The compliment slipped out before he could filter it. She blushed, a deep crimson rising up her neck. "This dress, it just appeared at my door. I assume the foundation sent it?" "Something like that," Julian lied. "Come, the ceremony is starting." He led her to the front table, his table. The elite of New York watched in confusion as the notoriously icy Julian Thorne pulled out a chair for a woman nobody recognized. The dinner passed in a blur. Then, the lights dimmed. Julian walked up to the podium. The spotlight hit him, blindingly bright. He adjusted the microphone, looking out at the sea of darkness, finding the one pair of eyes that mattered. "We live in a city of noise," Julian began, his voice echoing through the ballroom. "We measure value in stock prices, in real estate, in the height of our towers. But recently, I was taught a lesson." He paused. "I was taught that real efficiency isn't about the engine. It's about the maintenance of the whole. I was taught that if we build a system where the parts grind against each other, just to keep the top spinning, the machine breaks." In the front row, Elena froze. Her hand flew to her mouth. Those were her words. Literally her words. Spoken in the library weeks ago. "Efficiency without equality isn't efficient," Julian continued, his eyes locked on hers. "Tonight, we honor someone who is fixing the machine. A woman who worked in the shadows to bring light to the forgotten. The recipient of the Thorne Foundation's Silent Hero Award, and a grant of $2 million for the Green Hope Center. Ms. Elena Rossi." The room erupted in applause. Elena didn't move. She stared at Julian up on that stage. The pieces of the puzzle were slamming together in her mind with the force of a freight train. The sudden miracle donation. The way the anonymous grant letter used phrases about human capital. The books left on the table. The way he looked at her when she talked about the center. And now, him quoting her private conversation to a room of billionaires. It was him. It was always him. "Ms. Rossi?" The spotlight swung to her. She stood up on trembling legs. She walked up the stairs, the applause deafening. But she heard none of it. She reached the podium. Julian was holding a heavy crystal plaque. He held it out to her, his expression unguarded for the first time. He looked hopeful. She took the award. Their fingers brushed. "Thank you," she whispered into the microphone, her voice shaking. "Thank you." She cut the speech short. She couldn't breathe. She turned and walked off the stage, not back to her seat, but toward the terrace doors. "Elena!" Julian called out, abandoning the podium, ignoring the shocked murmurs of the crowd. He followed her. The terrace was cold. The wind from Central Park whipped at Elena's velvet dress. She was gripping the railing, looking out at the city lights, her chest heaving. The glass door opened behind her. Julian stepped out, closing the noise of the party behind him. "Elena, wait." She spun around. Her eyes were filled with tears, not of joy, but of a confusing, overwhelming storm of emotion. "It was you," she said. It wasn't a question. Julian stopped a few feet away. He put his hands in his pockets to hide that they were shaking. "Yes. The rent, the food supplies, the heating bill." She took a step closer, her voice rising. "My mother's surgery, the $50,000 bill that just disappeared. That was you?" "Yes." "Why?" she cried out, the sound tearing through the elegant silence. "Why did you do it? Was it a game? Was I just an experiment? The poor maid you could play God with?" "No!" Julian shouted back, the composure cracking. "It wasn't a game." "Then what was it? You let me scrub your floors while you were secretly writing checks that saved my life. You let me worry and cry and beg while you sat there with the answer in your pocket. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you would have left." Julian stepped into her space, his eyes blazing. "Because if I told you I was the one saving you, you would have felt indebted. You would have looked at me with gratitude, not with what I wanted." "And what did you want?" Elena challenged, tears spilling down her cheeks. "What could a man who owns half the city possibly want from me?" Julian looked at her. He looked at the fire in her eyes, the dignity in her stance, the sheer, beautiful force of her humanity. I wanted you to see me, he whispered. Not as the boss, not as the billionaire, just me. He took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs. I didn't do it for charity, Elena. I hate charity. Charity is pity. I don't pity you. I am in awe of you. Elena stopped. The wind seemed to die down. Julian reached out but didn't touch her. His hand hovered in the air between them. I have spent my life investing in things, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Stocks, bonds, companies, things that don't love you back. But when I saw you that night, when I saw you teaching those people, feeding them with my leftovers, I realized I was bankrupt. I had everything, and I was empty. He looked deep into her eyes, delivering the truth that had been burning a hole in his soul for weeks. I am not doing charity, Elena. I am investing in my own belief. And you are the one holding it. You made me believe that there is something in this world worth more than money. You saved me long before I saved you. Elena stared at him. The anger in her chest began to crumble, replaced by a profound, aching realization. She looked at this man, this powerful, terrifying man, and saw that he was telling the truth. He looked vulnerable. He looked scared. You saved my mother, she whispered, her voice breaking. I would have saved the whole world if you asked me to, Julian replied softly. Elena let out a sob, half laugh, half cry. She looked down at the crystal award in her hand, then back up at him. The gap between their worlds, the penthouse and the shelter, the velvet and the uniform, suddenly felt very small. You're a fool, Julian Thorne, she said, shaking her head. I know, he smiled, a crooked, self-deprecating smile. I'm new at this. You didn't have to do it in the shadows, she said, stepping closer. I would have seen you. I was already starting to see you. Julian's breath hitched. Were you? Yes. She closed the distance between them. She reached out and took his hand, the hand that signed the checks, the hand that had once been closed in a fist of suspicion. She held it. So, she whispered, looking up at him under the city lights. What happens to the investment now? Julian looked at her, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. Now, he said softly, we become partners. Spring arrived in New York, not with a shout, but with a whisper. The biting cold of the winter that had defined Julian and Elena's beginning began to thaw, replaced by the pale, determined green of new life pushing through the concrete cracks. For Julian Thorne, the transition was literal. His penthouse, once a fortress of glass and monochrome silence, had been invaded. It started with a single potted fern in the hallway, then a stack of books on social policy on the coffee table, then the smell of roasted garlic and oregano replacing the sterile scent of cleaning agents. Elena hadn't moved in fully. She insisted on keeping her small apartment in Queens for perspective, but her presence was rewriting the DNA of his life. Julian found he didn't miss the silence. In fact, he found the silence terrifying now. He preferred the sound of her humming as she reviewed grant applications at his dining table. It had been 6 months since the gala. 6 months of navigating a relationship that defied every social stratum in Manhattan. The tabloids had tried to run the story. Billionaire romances the help. But Julian had killed the narrative with a single, icy press conference where he referred to Elena solely as the director of the Thorne Foundation's outreach initiative. He didn't let them cheapen her. He shielded her not by hiding her, but by elevating her so high that no one dared to look down. But for Julian, dating felt insufficient. Dinners and movies were trivial. He was a man of infrastructure, of legacy. He didn't want a girlfriend. He wanted a co-architect. It happened on a Tuesday evening. The setting was unromantic by conventional standards, Julian's home office. Elena was sitting on the leather sofa, shoes kicked off, frowning at a spreadsheet on her laptop. Julian, the budget for the literacy program in the Bronx is tight. If we expand to the second district, we eat into the teacher training fund. Julian was at his desk. He swiveled his chair around. Then we increase the cap. We can't just print money, she countered, not looking up. I can, effectively, he said dryly. That's not sustainable. We need a structural fix, not a bailout. Julian smiled. He loved it when she argued with him. He stood up and walked over to a safe hidden behind a panel in the wall. He spun the dial. Elena, put the laptop away. I have a new project proposal for you to review. It requires immediate approval. Elena sighed, rubbing her temples. Can it wait until morning? My brain is fried. No, this one is time-sensitive. He walked over to the coffee table and placed a large, leather-bound portfolio in front of her. It wasn't a jewelry box. It looked like a merger acquisition document. Elena looked at it, confused. What is this? Are we buying another building? Open it. She flipped open the heavy cover. The first page was a high-resolution architectural rendering. But it wasn't a building. It was a timeline. Project Convergence. Partners, Julian Thorne and Elena Rossi. Duration, indefinite. Elena frowned. She turned the page. It was a business plan, but it was the most bizarre, beautiful business plan she had ever seen. Phase 1. Global expansion of Green Hope Centers. Locations, Rio, Mumbai, Lagos. Phase 2. The establishment of the Rossi Thorne Scholarship Fund. Phase 3. Cohabitation and asset merger. Subtext, moving in together permanently. Phase 4. Legacy construction. Under legacy construction, there was a subheading, raising the next generation to see both the tower and the street. Elena's breath hitched. She flipped to the final page. There was no graph, no data. Just a single sentence printed in the center of the page. I do not want to build an empire alone. I want to build a life with you. Will you be my partner? In the boardroom and in the quiet of the night? Forever? She stared at the words, her vision blurring. Julian dropped to one knee. He wasn't holding a diamond the size of a skating rink. He held a simple band of hammered gold. Imperfect, textured, real. I didn't want to give you a rock, Elena, he said softly, his voice trembling slightly. Diamonds are cold. I wanted to give you a plan. I know you like plans. Elena laughed, a wet, choked sound. You wrote a prospectus for our marriage. I did, he admitted, looking vulnerable in a way the world never saw. I told you once that I was investing in my own belief. You are that belief, Elena. You are the only thing that yields returns worth having. I love you, not just for who you are, but for who we are when we're standing next to each other. He looked at the ring. Will you sign the contract? Elena looked at the man who had followed her into the rain, who had sat in the mud outside her classroom, who had learned to see the world through her eyes. I have one condition, she whispered, wiping a tear from her cheek. Julian paused. Name it? The wedding, she said, a smile breaking through the tears. It's not going to be at the plaza. Julian smiled back, knowing exactly what she was going to say. Agreed. Then yes, she said, launching herself into his arms. I accept the merger. The wedding of the decade did not take place in a cathedral or a ballroom. It took place in East New York, at the end of a cracked pavement alleyway. The Green Hope Community Center had been scrubbed clean, but it was still the same brick building with the soul of a factory. The windows were open to the summer breeze. Inside, the transformation was nothing short of a miracle, not of money, but of community. The pews were mismatched chairs painted in bright colors by the children of the center. The decorations were not imported orchids, but thousands of paper flowers hand-folded by the women Elena had taught to read. Strings of warm yellow fairy lights draped from the exposed industrial rafters, turning the old room into a galaxy of stars. The guest list was a sociologist's nightmare. On the left side, Wall Street bankers in Tom Ford suits, looking uncomfortable but respectful. On the right side, mechanics in their Sunday best, grandmothers in hijabs, construction workers, and the homeless men Elena had fed for years, now clean-shaven and standing tall. When the music started, it wasn't a string quartet. It was a local gospel choir, their voices rising up to the peeling ceiling, filling the space with a sound so powerful it rattled the bones. Julian stood at the front of the room. He wore a tuxedo, but he had lost the severe, guarded look of a predator. He looked relaxed. He looked happy. When the doors opened, the room gasped. Elena walked down the aisle. She wore a dress of simple white lace, vintage and understated. She walked alone, but she walked with the strength of an army. As she passed the rows, people reached out to touch her hand, her students, her family. When she reached Julian, he took her hands. His grip was firm, anchoring. They didn't recite traditional vows. "I, Julian," he said, his voice carrying to the back of the room without a microphone, "promise to never let the silence return. I promise to use what I have to lift what you love. I promise that my wealth will never be a wall between us, but a bridge for others. You taught me how to see, Elena. I promise to never look away again." Elena squeezed his hands, her eyes shining. "I, Elena," she whispered, "promise to remind you that you are worthy, not for what you own, but for who you are. I promise to keep your heart warm when the world is cold. I promise to build with you, to fight with you, and to love you, from the penthouse to the pavement, until the work is done." When they kissed, the applause was a thunderclap. It was a collision of two worlds that had finally learned to speak the same language. Outside, it began to rain. But inside, under the paper flowers and the fairy lights, it was warm. 5 years later, the sun was setting over the skyline of Nairobi, casting long purple shadows across the dusty playground. "Mr. Thorne! Mr. Thorne! Watch this!" Julian laughed as a soccer ball sailed past his head. He was in shirt sleeves, his tie abandoned hours ago, his expensive loafers covered in red dust. He kicked the ball back to a group of laughing children. "Good form, Leo!" he shouted. He wasn't the CEO in a glass tower anymore. He was still the chairman of the board, but his office was wherever the work was. He walked over to the edge of the field where a new building stood. It was a state-of-the-art vocational school, built with local materials, designed to run on solar power. Above the door, a simple sign read, "Green Hope Global, Kenya Campus." Standing by the entrance was a woman with a clipboard and a messy bun, arguing passionately with a contractor in Swahili. Elena. She looked tired. There were a few new lines around her eyes, etched by long flights and hard decisions. But she was radiant. She finished her conversation, shook the contractor's hand, and turned to see Julian watching her. She smiled, that same smile that had once illuminated a dark alley in New York. She walked over to him, looping her arm through his. "The solar grid is up. We open on Monday." "We did it," Julian said, looking at the building. "We did," she agreed. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Are you tired?" "Exhausted," he admitted. "But it's a good tired." "The best kind." They stood there for a moment, watching the kids play soccer in the twilight. Julian thought back to the man he used to be. The man who measured his life in the silence of a penthouse, who suspected a maid of stealing leftovers because he couldn't comprehend generosity. That man felt like a stranger now, a ghost. He looked down at his wife. "You know," he said softly, I used to think I was the richest man in the world." Elena looked up at him, raising an eyebrow playfully. "And now?" Julian squeezed her hand, looking at the school they had built, the children they were helping, and the life they shared. "Now," he said, kissing her forehead, "I finally am." The sun dipped below the horizon, and the lights of the school flickered on, hundreds of them, shining like beacons in the gathering dusk. It was a symphony of light, composed by two people who had dared to bridge the gap between their worlds, proving that the greatest fortune is not what you keep, but what you give away together.